I'm Dr. Carol Francis, and here's just a little bit about my background so that you know that I have the authentic credentials to be able to service you. Now let's move on. The project that we're working on here is a summit, and it's also full of courses for you, classes for you, and it's called Paths to Recovery After Abuse and Trauma. And these are the contact bits of information in case you want to contact me, get any of the information or materials I suggest in this presentation, or pre-order any books. Well, let's move on. I want to talk about our vulnerable selves. Well, look at this. Everybody, whether you've been abused or traumatized any way, shape, or forms, we are vulnerable. And there's no two ways about it. But what is so unfortunate is that when we are abused and traumatized, it compromises us. It compromises us physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, and financially. It just isn't even fair that what we go through in terms of someone else's abuse and traumatizing us actually impacts us, but it does. And in fact, if we are abused or traumatized as children, we, in any of these sorts of ways, and the mild ones are at the bottom of this pyramid, and the real complex ones are at the top of this pyramid. Really seriously awful sorts of things are the different types of abuse or trauma that we can experience as children, and we can bring it forward and play it with other situations. Sexual abuse as children or teens is even considered more intense. It more intensely damages our bodies, our minds, our brains, our self-esteem, and our relationships. And it's more traumatizing the younger that we are, of course, the longer that it is, and when it is coordinated with other sorts of serious complications. A research that began in the 1990s with 17,000 different peoples is called ACE, or Aggravated Childhood Experiences, and they have developed so much wonderful, helpful information to really put this into some perspective. But these adverse childhood experiences have more impact on the rest of our life from the beginning to death than almost any other sort of complications that we encounter. And that is something we really need to take seriously. Now, they developed 10 indices that related to you being able to look at whether or not you've had childhood or teenhood abuse or trauma. And here are 8 of those. And you can stop the video at this point and really ask yourself those questions. And you'll notice that the last 4 of these 8 have everything to do with different types of sexual abuse. Now, sexual abuse causes much more difficulty and a vulnerability to disease in women than it does in men. However, we'll discuss the other side of this in a moment. And it is a high correlation to cervical and breast cancer because of the human papillomavirus, the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, all sorts of sexual transmitted diseases that compromise your immune system, and of course, all the impact of traumatization, which we'll talk more about. And so women become much more vulnerable to different types of cancer when they have been sexually abused as a child. The correlation is really outstanding, and it's awful, and it just is incredibly unfair. I find it incredibly unfair, and we must simply stop this from happening. And that is the whole goal of my book, Paths to Recovery After Abuse and Trauma, which provides ways to reduce these likelihoods. We just simply must reduce them. Men, too, though, are very much vulnerable to this. The oldest statistics that have been accumulated that are still relied on is that 1 out of every 7 men are abused in one fashion or form. 1 out of every 4 women are sexually abused or raped. But it's hard to believe that men are exposed to such situations, but they definitely are. It's a secret kept among boys in a way that they learn about their sexuality, often not about them being homosexuals, about them experimenting, and then it can turn into groups where they actually become kind of abusive toward one another. I have a wonderful program about priests that committed pedophiles on little boys. It's a really sad story, a real story by the author of Millstone. But it's a really good interview, and you can look for that online. But the locker room horrors, fraternity horrors, military horrors, which are just outstandingly compounding the post-traumatic stress complications. And I have a post on that on my Facebook that really, for any men, it's not just women who are sexually abused in the military, it's women as well. Of course, within the prison system, and child trafficking as well. We are all vulnerable to abuse and trauma. Seriously. Men, women, boys, children, wives, husbands, we are all vulnerable to it. And what it creates inside of us is what I call a vulnerability coefficient. We're all vulnerable. There's nothing inside of us that isn't like fragile, able to be killed quickly, toxins that we can be sensitized to that harm us. Then there are mental toxins, physical abuse toxins, as I might call them, or natural and man-made causes that can harm us. We are vulnerable. And I will be having on my website a vulnerability coefficient test so that you can kind of see, well, how vulnerable have you come? And what's very important to know is that when we are very conscious of our vulnerability, we actually develop a kind of an intimate relationship with our vulnerability. What I mean is a close relationship. We're kind of become attached to our awareness, our identity of being vulnerable. And some people call that the victimization or the victim ideal or identity, or the victim, you're such a victim kind of judgmental statements that are made. I call it the vulnerability coefficient, and we all have it. There's also what I would call what's a resilience coefficient, because you have to realize that even when you're sick, even if you have a tumor in your breast, for example, and it's encapsulated, the rest of your body functions. When you have a flu, the rest of your body functions. When you break a limb, the rest of your body functions. And that's your resilience. And along with that, there's the resilience that demonstrate that people do recover after traumas most of the time. They recover after abuse most of the time. Maybe not to the fullest extent, but there's some level of functioning recovery. People cope, they endure, they survive, they escape, they recover, and they do thrive. And that ability to do so is what I would call the resilience coefficient. Now, consider that we have to really have resilience in our body, because our body is attacked when we are emotionally, physically, and sexually abused and traumatized. Our telomeres are the end of our chromosomes, and when we're very young, those telomeres are on our cells, and every single one of our cells tells our cells to live long, happy, and prosper. The Mr. Spock of Star Trek's phrase, live long and prosper, the telomeres. If you have experienced abuse, and particularly sexual abuse as a child, they can notice that the telomeres are shortened, and they increase in their being shortened. In other words, the damage done to them, the more the abuse is taking place. The ACA, the ACE, remember we were talking about the horrible things that happen to children and the 10 indices of when a child has really experienced aggravated childhood abuse, finds that the telomeres are very short in children. What is really good about their body's resilience is that you can turn that process around in your cells, and actually we can see that telomeres can grow with various assistance and help. And that's part of the program that's related to the recovery from abuse and trauma. DNA codes are impacted. We used to think the DNA in our cells were just completely stationary. They were what they were for good or for bad, and that's the way they would be. But epigenetics tells us that good things can happen to our DNA and can activate the good aspects of our DNA and can even possibly change DNA for the good. And sadly, the reverse is true as well. Bad things can harm our DNA, and bad things can trigger the complicated parts of our DNA, and bad things can alter our DNA. It does seem. Another thing is the angiogenetics, which is the ability of the blood to fuel cells. And it appears that sexual abuse and other types of abuses, but especially sexual abuse, can actually activate blood circulating into cancer cells that lie dormant inside our bodies. And they're dormant because there's no blood to create growth. So they die. I mean, they're not fueled, so they die. There's no food going to them, so they die. But with the stressors of these experiences can cause the blood to go to the cells that are carcinogenic. This can be reversed as well. Our brains are also impacted by trauma and abuse. And fortunately, our brains have neuroplasticity. Now that we know that our cells, the circuits in our brain, the neurotransmitters, the chemicals that work with the receptor sites and the processes, all of them can be improved after abuse and trauma if you go through the recovery process, but they can be really harmed if you don't. So the stress hormones equally are activated, aggravated, and sustained, causing all sorts of damage and havoc with your body. And in contrast, a decrease in growth hormones, which keep you alive and growing and young all the way up through age 25, they're saying now. It used to be 18, it used to be 6. No, but with abuse, those growth hormones are harmed. Our immune system's compromised, but can be helped. Our respiratory system can be compromised, but can heal. Our cardiovascular system can be compromised by abuse and trauma, but it can be improved. So here's the whole idea. We do have what I am now calling the hardiness coefficient. That's a really old-fashioned term, but think of it this way. The hardiness coefficient is your ability to sustain effort to carry out some task. Let's say if you're going to chop down a tree, and the hardiness is your ability to sustain it until the job is done. It is your power, it is your empowerment, it is your strength. It is your fighting spirit, it is your ability to conquer difficulties. It is your ability to defeat enemies. It is the vigorousness with which you approach life. It's your determination and your tenacity. And all of those aspects help you turn your vulnerability coefficients into your resilience capacity and moving forward. And I call that your hardiness coefficient. And again, I'm going to have on my website and available to you if you want to pre-order it, an ability to check off the list of what is your hardiness or your resilience coefficient to be able to move forward, because that's actually what will help. Yes, there is help, you bet. And what will help is anything and everything that activates your resilience and your hardiness and helps you deal with your vulnerability. We're not sitting there making anybody feel guilty or judged for feeling vulnerable, because we're all vulnerable. And we want to have a relationship with our vulnerability that allows it to be healthy, navigated, fluid, and flowing, but not stuck and not our whole identity. We want to have an authentic connection with our vulnerability and at the same time know that we have resilience and hardiness working on our side. But you are not alone. But the thing is about this is that once you have been abused, you have got to test the trustworthiness of all individuals who are there to help you. Because you never know in the world of abuse and trauma recovery when someone has slipped in there who's not a good egg. And I tell you, it's disgusting to me that people take advantage of other people. They're narcissistic, they're con artists, they're abusive, but that's the whole reason why we call them abusers. And they enter into the world where people are most vulnerable because they know that that's where they're going to have the most amount of success. So remember this one axiom if you remember nothing else from this video. Never give your trust away. Always have your trust earned. And anybody that's going to help you, any of these people on this list and elsewise that really is going to help you, needs to know that they're going to be tested by you. Of course they are. Whether it's an intimate relationship with your family or a psychologist like I am, I tell individuals that come to see me, take your time to work with me and take your time to really experience a sense of trust. Don't just leap into this. Actually, let's go through the process of what does it even mean to test someone to see if they're trustworthy. Because it's possible that through abuse and trauma, you've kind of forgotten who you can trust and who you cannot. Now, once you've been able to kind of trust, I want you to know that there's so many different psychotherapies out there that are available for you. And here's just a list of some of them. Whew, not even going to say them. There's so many there. Soak it in and realize that no matter where you are on the paths of recovery that are available to you, there are many, many approaches that will match your personality and the phase that you are in. And you want to work with a therapist that has a plethora, a lot of different tools to be able to help you. Now, recovery involves a number of things. Eventually, not necessarily at the beginning, you are going to rework your narrative of your abuse and trauma. You're going to do it safely, securely, and you're going to pace it wisely. And the reworking of it, the retelling of the story, is not meant to re-trigger, nor is it meant to cause you to, reactivate or re-traumatize yourself. Instead, it's to help you integrate the experience into your left brain, your right brain, into your language centers, into your emotional centers, so that you can talk your way through all of your experiences in a way that helps you move out of them. It's a little bit like you're trapped in a well and you have to figure out which bricks you can step on and climb up. And maybe you go a little distance and fall. And maybe you go that little distance and you find new footing, so you go that way. And then maybe you go a little bit more distance and you find your next footing and maybe you fall. But you keep coming and climbing and trying over and over again until you get yourself completely out of the well. And while that's really kind of a disgusting sort of imagery, I want you to recognize that in retelling your story so that you can come out of the well each time you tell it faster, clearer, less traumatized, less overwhelmed by it, the more you have become the victor over it. But that has to be done so carefully, so safely, so securely, and so well paced so that you do not re-traumatize yourself or merely become an individual that repeats your victim experience over and over again, such that you rewire it into your brain. And we can talk a whole lot more about the neuroprocessing of rewiring the same story over and over and over again. Secondly, you need to be able to experience healthy attachments and healthy role models in your life with people who have endured and know how to help you recover. But again, you have to test to see who's healthy or not. And that is a process in and of itself. You want to meet those who have recovered and who are thriving, but be very careful about hooking up or meeting up with people who have escaped, but they haven't recovered. They are stuck. They're not really working on the process, and they may actually walk right back into their own trauma, and they might take you with it. So rather, you want to deal with talking with people who have actually recovered. They're thriving. They've gotten out of it. And that's one reason I have my second book coming out, which is actually stories of people who have recovered and are thriving so that you can see what they've gone through. And then you'll find information and paths for you to take that will help you along the way accordingly. And then you want to address and rework the following. That's a long list, right? Shame, blame, guilt, confusion, the Stockholm effect, vulnerabilities, weakness. Lastly, though, I really want to take time. You're not going to focus on forgiving your abuser or traumatizer. Regardless of what the literature has said, forgiveness is not what you're focusing on. What you're focusing on is releasing. And you're not releasing them from guilt. You're releasing you from the horror that they put you through. You're releasing you from any of the residual anger, rage, vulnerability, hate, not because you're releasing them and forgiving them, but because you're releasing you. And that's not just something you just decide to do necessarily. It comes as a consequence of becoming more and more repaired, more and more healed, and more capable of setting yourself free. And that is why I talk about the 12 R's of recovery. These 12 R's of recovery are described in my book, Paths to Recovery After Abuse. And I would be very, very glad to give you a free copy of that chapter. It's a PDF. It's not in its final form. You will need to contact me, and the contact information is drcarolfrancis@gmail.com. It's also abuse, trauma, recovery, Dr. Francis at gmail.com. Really long email, I know. We actually use that for the business portion of this, but you can reach me there as well. And Dr. Carol Francis is DrCarol Francis at gmail.com. And now, let's talk about the different types of therapies that are available for you. In my work with you, I very much would like to talk to you about the gifts of your imagination, which are associated to the wonderful tools of guided imagery, hypnosis, and meditations. Also, the gift of biofeedback helps retrain soldiers and those individuals that have experienced trauma where they've forgotten how to have regulated heart rates, regulated breathing, and regulated stress-free experiences in their body. And I use the EM Wave 2 to help people do that. And also the gift of neurobiofeedback, where I use Muse of the NeuroSky to help people learn how, yet again, to shift from stress consciousness into relaxation and carefree consciousness. There's so many approaches, but those are 3 gifts that are really clear. And of course, the myriad of other types of psychotherapies that are available too. My book and the courses related to the summit associated to past recovery after abuse and trauma and the true stories of survivors who recovered after abuse and trauma will be coming out September 2018 if all goes well. I would love to be able to get a copy of that to you, and will be able to pre-order this on Amazon.com, and definitely go ahead and send me an email as well. Okay, folks, this is, I know this may feel long to you, but to me, there's so much more information I want to give you. This is just the surface and is one in a whole series of information I want to be able to give you as we move along in this summit. So, Dr. Carol Francis signing off and saying to you, you are amazing. You have this resilience and this hardiness in you. And now we really need to capture it. And I'm glad to be here to help you do that. Take care. Bye-bye.